I'm so sorry.
As of today, there are only two genders, male and female.
Okay, so if I'm no longer a human, legally speaking, of course, I might as well have fun.
This will put trans people at risk of violence.
Trump said there are only two genders, and the Wi-Fi password movement is not coping well. We're gonna break down the latest meltdown from the LGBT activist crowd and so much more on today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across the internet, across our politics, and across our media, all from an independent perspective. Up first, like I mentioned, Trump just made big waves with one of his first business acts as president, signing an executive order declaring that the federal government will only recognize two genders, aka two sexes, male and female, and the LGBT influencer and activist crowd is not taking the news well. Here's my personal favorite from the gay news influencer on Instagram and TikTok.
Breaking gay news. I'm so sorry.
As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
It's the dramatic music for me. It's the, I'm so sorry, the horrified face. Like, I've watched this like 15 times and it still cracks me up. But like, am I the only one that missed the gay news part? This doesn't have anything to do with gay people. Now, it does have ramifications for transgender people and the gender identity activists, and we're going to go through them. But this is the tenor of how things are being received. So I'm going to try to walk you through what it does and doesn't do and the nuances of it. But most of that's being missed by the people hyperventilating over it at the moment. So let's look at the actual executive order. It's titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. The core of the policy is very simple. It is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. Under my direction, the executive branch will enforce sex-protective laws to promote this reality, and the following definitions shall govern all executive interpretation of and application of federal law and administration policy. Sex shall refer to an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. Sex is not a synonym for and does not include the concept of gender identity. Women or woman and girls or girl shall mean adult and juvenile human females respectively. Men or man and boys or boy shall mean adult and juvenile human males, respectively. It goes on from there, but you get the idea. The federal government, under the Trump administration, will define sex, not gender identity or your inner perception of self, and it will define it as immutable and based on your biology and your reproductive system. So far, everything that's in this executive order is true, whether it offends some people, whether it upsets some people's sensibilities, it is true. There are only two sexes. You cannot change your sex in truth, and all people, with the rarest of exceptions into some people that fall under the category of intersex, but it's a tiny decimal point of the population, are either male or female. And in almost all cases, it's extremely easy to identify which sex a person belongs to. Now, the policy ramifications of this order are then fleshed out in great detail. For one, there will be no more X markers on federal documents like passports, something that was introduced under the Biden administration in 2022, where instead of sex, male or female, you could put an X if you felt like it. That's good. We should get rid of that because it's ridiculous. No human being's sex is X, and it's actually important to have documentation that accurately states people's sex so that when sex segregation is appropriate, we can enforce it as such. The executive order also outlines that sex segregation will be implemented through the Department of Housing and Urban Development in things like rape shelters and crisis shelters for women only will be limited to biological females. It also makes very clear that federal prisons are to be segregated by sex, not gender identity or trans identity, males and females. This is complete common sense when it comes to correcting the insanity that we've seen where biologically male criminals are being placed in women's prisons under the Biden administration and in many blue states like California, even in some cases, murderers and sex offenders. That's obvious lunacy that compromises women's rights, safety, and fairness. However, this policy also leaves something to be desired that the Trump administration has outlined here, because we do need a trans ward or some sort of third space in the federal prison system for genuinely trans people, because putting trans women in the men's prison is going to make them unsafe. Trans women being people who biologically their sex is technically male, but they have transitioned to appear as female in many ways and walk the world as women in many cases, passing. They would obviously be set up for some pretty horrific abuse if put into a men's prison. I think the solution needs to be some sort of third space, a trans ward, if you will. And this order doesn't flesh that out. It seems to suggest that trans women will just be put into the men's prison. And I do have a problem with that. I think we can find a compromise here that respects the safety and dignity of everyone involved. And this part of the order doesn't quite do that. The other thing in this order that I have somewhat of an issue with is that it states that the Bureau of Prisons will no longer provide any form of gender-affirming care to prisoners or inmates. Now, where I think that's coming from is that the Kamala Harris campaign, very famously in ads that went out, was on the record in support of taxpayer-funded transition surgeries for inmates and undocumented immigrants detained in federal facilities, which I think, because they're incredibly costly and also because they're not actually very scientifically substantiated in terms of evidence, are essentially similar to cosmetic surgeries, that struck most Americans as ridiculous and extreme and a waste of taxpayer resources. But I think this order goes a little bit too far in the opposite direction, in that if you have a trans woman in prison or a trans man in prison and they've taken hormone therapy for many years, I really don't see any reason why it shouldn't still be provided like other medications would. It's not particularly expensive. It would run anywhere from $50 to $80 a month for a prescription that's actually quite affordable and cheap. And if it's medically necessary and doctors say they need it for their mental health, I'm just not sure why that wouldn't be provided to them, the same way that anti-anxiety medication might be provided to someone, or antidepressants or something like that. To me, depriving people of hormones who've been taking them for many years will mess with their bodies, mess with their mental health. I don't see any reason why that shouldn't continue to be provided. But I think what we're witnessing here is something of a pendulum swing. The left under the Biden administration and the leadership of trans activists push things to such an insane extreme that Trump is just resetting everything, going back to the starting point where everything was a couple of decades ago and saying no to the insanity. But I do think some of these policies lack nuance, and there's pieces of it I object to. I mean, at the very least, you could give trans inmates or prisoners the chance to pay for hormone therapy themselves and continue to receive it in prison. Like somebody who's been taking estrogen for decades and then taking it away, or testosterone or vice versa, you're going to wreak havoc on their body and their psyche. And I just don't see any reason that's necessary or appropriate. Now, this is my nuanced analysis of this executive order. Then there's the reception it's getting from the trans community in, well, really the activist community. And that is absolutely unhinged. We're going to take a look at one video that is interesting, I guess. In many ways, it left me lost for words. Take a listen.
Our new president has declared on day one of his presidency that our country will no longer recognize any gender aside from male or female. As a non-binary person who lives in the United States of America, I'm a New Yorker. I live in New York. I'm not going anywhere. I love this city. All right. Okay. So if I'm no longer a human, legally speaking, of course, I might as well have fun.
What? Huh? I'm no longer a human? No. Just because somebody doesn't acknowledge and enshrine into law your personality or whatever non-binary is supposed to mean in this context, and instead just correctly denotes your biological sex, doesn't mean that you're not a human. No one's saying that. Like, girl, calm down. And I'm sorry about what is going on with this? Is it makeup? Or is it marker? Like, what is going on?
I might as well have fun if I'm no longer legally a human. What does that make me? Something else? Something scary? Do I scare you?
To be honest, yeah, a little bit.
Okay, I might as well be the monster you've made me. But nah, I can't. I'm not a monster. I'm actually full of love. There's a lot of uncertainty in the air, and one thing I do know for sure, one thing I am certain about, is that fun and interesting, weird, crazy-looking makeup brings me a lot of joy.
Babe, literally no one said you can't put whatever on your face you want to put on. You can draw marker squiggly lines all over your face and do whatever all that is. That's not changing. Nobody stops that, but it doesn't change your biological sex. That's all the government is saying here, that you're still a female, even if you take a marker and scribble all over your face. Like, what is going on?
I love doing this. And I know that it brings a lot of other queer people a lot of joy. So how am I spending my day this inauguration day? I am going to go commiserate with my fellow queer people at my favorite lesbian bar, ready for the circus.
I'm sorry. Not her calling other people a circus. Babe, the audacity! And why are you going to a lesbian bar if you're non-binary? The math is not mathing. I can't help but feel bad for this kind of person in all seriousness, though, because they seem to be getting very worked up and have a lot of misconceptions about what is and isn't happening. Nobody's stopping you from being quirky, from being a little odd, from doodling on your face, from calling yourself whatever you want. They're just saying that your biological sex on your federal documents is not going to be a choose your own adventure game anymore. That's it, babe. That's it. Unless, you're going to end up in prison or something where you may have to encounter some of these issues I talked about, which I hope you don't, but it's not that deep and it's not that insane to say there's two sexes and you can't change them. Like, that is the default position of most of human history. So, but non-binary TikTokers are not the only ones kind of crashing out over this news. ACLU transgender activist and lawyer Chase Strangio went on Democracy Now!, a left-wing network, and kind of crashed out over Trump's executive order, stating that there are only two sexes and sex cannot be changed. We're gonna take a look and buckle up, because this interview is a real doozy.
And one executive order also includes a directive that forces the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to submit a policy for, quote, protecting women seeking single-sex rape shelters. Can you talk about this potentially putting trans people at risk?
Yeah, so there are many, many instructions in this one executive order, including this directive to HUD to issue proposed regulations to, in essence, exclude trans people from various forms of shelter system under the auspices that a trans person is an inherent threat to non-transgender women. Obviously, that just enhances the risk that transgender people face in society if we are deemed as a threat to others simply by existing. And the order also includes directions to, for example, the Secretary of State and Department of Homeland Security to possibly revoke the passports of transgender people because those passports do not reflect this quote unquote biological reality that sex is only binary at the time of conception.
There's no quote unquote reality. That's just the reality, babe. And yeah, if somebody's passport has an X on it, it should be revoked and then they can get a new one that is accurate. It is actually important to have accurate statements of biological sex on government documents. That's not a hate crime, babe. It's a correction of an insane policy by the last administration. Now, the main point here, Chase and this activist journalist on Democracy Now! Suggest that women are fundamentally unreasonable and bigoted if they want, for example, sex-segregated rape shelters. Yeah. No. If women are seeking a space like that, it is because, in most cases, they have experienced deep trauma at the hands of a man. And it's not crazy for them to want to exclude biological males from those spaces. It actually makes a lot of sense, because y'all throw this word around like candy on Halloween, but in this one case it's actually appropriate. That might be triggering for them. So trans people who need those kinds of services might need to go to a different space. And that's okay. That's not the end of the world if they have to go to a different third space shelter that is for trans folks. gender non-conforming people, that is open to all, whatever. But if some women want women-only spaces to process some of the most horrific trauma imaginable, and you try to take that away from them and suggest that that makes them bigots or that that makes you unsafe, you're the bad guy. You're the one being unreasonable and close-minded. And it's that kind of extreme advocacy that's just so out of touch and so radical that has really, I think, prompted this backsliding in support for trans rights among the public. You're playing yourself, babe. I don't know what to tell you. You're playing yourself. But this interview somehow got worse.
We know that people rely on accurate identification to move freely through the country and around the world. This will put trans people at risk of violence. It means every time you have an encounter with the government, the likelihood that you will be outed is significantly increased. And then with that outing comes the risk of discrimination, harassment, and potentially violence. So trans people are bracing themselves for a lot of negative outcomes here, not just symbolic, but really material ones. I know the community is scared. I know people are confused. And in this chaos, we just have to come together and build all of the forms of resistance that we know how to. But it is scary and it is alarming to read those executive orders last night.
Oh, boy. I mean, there's something kind of Orwellian about the person who wants documents to say people's sex are the opposite of what their sex is, complaining that documents are no longer going to be accurate. No, they actually are going to be accurate now. That's the point. And I just don't get what Chase is saying about how this is going to put trans people at risk of danger or something. So is the suggestion here that when you're traveling internationally as Chase Strangio, who appears as a trans man, not quite passing as a man, especially with the voice, but appears more masculine and has facial hair in many ways, and you go up to the passport officer and they open up your passport and it correctly notes that you're female. Now, look, maybe there should be some sort of marker you can get for like transgender recognition in addition to that, but your sex is female and it's going to accurately state that on your documents now. That the passport officer is going to see that and assault you and hurt you or something. That's not a thing. I'm struggling to think of the situation in which showing a government official correct documentation of your sex will result in a trans person being beat up or harmed, like Chase is saying. And to be clear, if that happens, that official should be prosecuted. You can't assault people because of what their papers say. That's insane. But I just don't think that's a thing. And I feel like this is insane alarmism and hyperbole. And I'm a little bit worried about what Chase means by all means of resistance, because some of this trans activist crowd gets a little crazy when it comes to their resistance. So it slightly frightens me. And I would have loved the host there to ask Chase, what do you mean by resistance exactly? Because hopefully Chase just means peaceful protesting, lawsuits, other things within the bounds of kind of normal democratic society. But with some of these trans activists, that's not what they mean. And I would have appreciated some clarity on that. But look, I think this interview for me really showed how out of touch trans activists are at the mainstream LGBT activist organizations and the left-wing organizations like the ACLU. And I think if the trans community, for which I count friends that belong to it and who I really do want to have freedom and dignity like anyone else, if they want to have public acceptance in the long run, they need to present a much more reasonable and moderate face to the public than whatever the heck we just saw. Because the American public's never going to be on board with all that nonsense. I'm sorry, they're just not. But what do you guys think? Do you support Trump's executive order on the two sexes, or are you also deeply traumatized and unsafe by it? Let me know in the comments. I do take the time to read the comment section, and I always love hearing what you guys have to say. Plus, make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet, and do hit that like button while you're at it. And now, we got to check in with a feminist TikTok influencer, Drew Afualo, who's kind of crashing out and lashing out at her own fans over Trump's election. Let's take a look at this really aggressive video.
Hey, just want to give all of y'all a really quick reminder, a refresher, if you will. I always have and always will hate that rotted orange.
Oh, that's a stable and insane way to speak and think and feel. Like, I'm sorry, but if you hate anyone that much that you don't know, like, maybe log off for a little, babe. Log off.
I've been hating him. I'm an OG hater, bitch. We can kick it off at 2016. Fucking sure. I was on the front lines of hating that fucking bitch.
And how did that go for y'all? Honestly, how did that go for y'all? Just hating and despising Trump, calling him names, insulting him. Did it make him go away? Did it make your candidates win? Did it win over the public? No, it didn't, did it? So, not sure that's something you should be proud about, that your side responded so hatefully rather than with curiosity about why people turned to Trump and what had gone wrong in society that pushed people towards such an admittedly extreme option. That's what I don't like about this kind of take that some people on the left have. There's no curiosity, there's no intellectual humility, there's no reflection, just hate. And regardless of what direction it's aimed in, hate is a blinding emotion. It is a thought-terminating emotion. It is one that all humans experience at times, but that we should always be not boasting about or embracing, but trying to control and override with logic and reason and thought. But our friend here is certainly not doing that.
And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If you like him, love him, even tolerate him, I hate you too.
Oh, well, that's a lovely sentiment, that you hate half of the country just because they disagree with you politically, or not even like Trump, but just tolerate him. What does that mean? Tolerate him just means you coexist. You don't want to destroy or shut down or silence him. So your point is that if people have any sort of tolerance for agreeing to disagree or accepting that other people get to say things they don't like, or that people might vote for someone they don't support, you even hate them for that? Babe, you're not the reasonable one here. I don't know how to tell that to you. It's giving unhinged. It's giving demonic. Yet this video has 610,000 likes from people who apparently agree with this. Also, maybe I'm crazy, but I feel like as an influencer and a podcast host, blithely insulting half the country when you rely on having, including your own fans. She's literally saying, if you follow me, if you like my content, but you voted for him or even tolerate him, I despise you. Is like just not smart strategy. But I mean, credit for putting your money where your mouth is, I guess. If you're really willing to die on this hill professionally, go off, I guess. It's your funeral, babe.
Just in case there's any confusion, no, I don't want you here. No, I don't give a if you unfollow me. I want you to get the up out of my house, bitch. For real. I also find it incredibly shocking that so many people in that front row and that bitch at the podium too are so fucking transphobic and yet have so much gender affirming care. There had to be a record broken for how much Juvederm was at the fucking inaugural address this morning, bitch.
Okay, that one was kind of funny, but you do hear this talking point a lot. Plastic surgery is not the same thing as gender affirming care. One of them is improving your appearance or making yourself look the way that you want to in terms of attractiveness and beauty standards. The other is trying to change your body so that you resemble the sex you are not. And to be clear, I support adults doing that. If that's what they want to do, knock yourself out. It's a free country. You do you, boo. But I just get frustrated when people pretend that two kind of categorically and fundamentally distinct things are the same. It's a disingenuous conflation. We all know that a nose job is not the same thing as a female getting a double mastectomy so that they can appear more masculine. Those aren't the same thing. I'm sorry, babe. They're just not. Anyway, there's more.
Why you would ever support that bitch and think for any reason at all that you and I would have anything in common is beyond me, bitch.
See, this just comes off as so close-minded. You might have a lot of things in common with somebody who disagrees with you politically. You might be from the same place. You might have the same faith. You might like the same hobbies. You might have some of the same experiences or trauma. Like, there's literally so much you could have in common with someone and even still have different politics. And this is just incredibly close-minded. I don't know how people think this is a good way to go through the world, let alone a way that's ever going to lead to any sort of political support for your side. I mean, you're just writing everyone off as evil and saying you have nothing in common with them. That's kind of the opposite of actual politics, where you try to connect on common ground where you do have it, and then maybe bring them over more to your side on the things where you don't have common ground. She's like, nah, if you disagree with me on this, we're just finito, done. You're dead to me. I hate you. By the way, Hate has no home here. I'm a progressive. Love and tolerance. Also, what is this camera angle? Girl, not flattering, just so you know.
And that fact should never fucking surprise you. Anyways, for the rest of you, I love you. I hope you're taking care of yourself, and I hope you're taking breaks off your phone.
Girl, I think you need to take some breaks off your phone because you have clearly inhabited an echo chamber for too long and become genuinely hateful and spiteful towards your fellow citizens and really have no curiosity to understand how they might disagree with you or anything about why somebody might reach different conclusions than you in your infinite wisdom. That's what bothers me about this. It's the complete dearth of any sort of intellectual humility, any space for the idea that maybe I'm 25 or whatever and I don't have the whole world figured out. I think my opinions are correct about most things, but I'm not 100% certain that they are. And I am not 1000% certain to the point where someone who disagrees with me is not just wrong, but must be evil. There's no other explanation. It's just so arrogant and so hubristic, but it's exactly the mentality that these kinds of influencers have completely embraced and embodied.
We always have been our own heroes. This isn't gonna change that. Love y'all, and anyone who supports that bitch. That's it. Love you. Bye.
Well, she's just delightful and very ladylike. Look, as far as I'm concerned, the influencer class can keep taking this approach to politics. How's it going for them? How's it working? Are they getting the outcomes that they want? Is their side doing well? No. People are sick of this crap. The culture is swinging in the opposite direction in every way. And it's the fault of people like this who put honestly the most toxic face imaginable on progressive politics. But you know what? Their fan base loves it. They profit off of it. They build up a niche, loyal, diehard audience they can extract money from and validation. And who cares if they coarsen our discourse, make America more hateful and more divided, and actually make their own side less popular? They get a lot of validation and praise from a fringe minority of their own side and get to have a career as somebody who runs their mouth on the internet. And yes, I'm aware of the hypocrisy of me saying that in a negative fashion, because that's what I also do. But I would like to think at least that I do it in a somewhat more thoughtful and less toxic way than Drew Afualo. But that's just my thoughts. You let me know what you think about that video in the comments below. I'm sure some of y'all will have strong feelings, and do hit that like button while you're at it. Now, we got to talk about one of the more controversial things Trump has done since taking the presidency yet again: his pardons for people involved in the January 6th riot at the Capitol. Guys, we're going to dive into this one, but I want to tell you, there's so many things going on in Trump world that I want to comment on, but it's just too much is happening too fast. I can't keep up with it all and prepare segments on all of it. So I'm going to try to get to as much as I can, but there'll be some things I just won't be able to do segments on because I only have so much capacity, and he's doing so much so fast, some of which I really like, some of which I'm kind of not sure about, and then a couple things that I do have a problem with. But first, I want to just play you guys a clip from Fox News where the host outlines what Trump is doing here with the pardons, and then conservative legal analyst Jonathan Turley explains some of the problems with the prosecutions where they went overboard and why these pardons were even discussed in the first place. Take a listen.
This is January 6th. These are the hostages, approximately 1,500 for a pardon.
Yes.
Full pardon. They've been treated very unfair. The judges have been absolutely brutal. The prosecutors have been brutal. Nobody's ever treated people in this country like that.
President Trump issuing a pardon last evening for nearly 1,600 people charged, many of them jailed for the January 6th attack on the Capitol. That sweeping executive order also commuting the sentences of 14 members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, most convicted of seditious conspiracy for that riot. Jonathan Turley, constitutional attorney here. Hello to you, sir. One of the more controversial pardons.
Thank you.
That we have seen. I'll get to the Hunter stuff and James Biden in a moment here. But with regard to this one, this is part of your book, Indispensable Right, when you talk about the troubling aspects of these cases. Today in the Post, you say the excessive treatment of some of the defendants undermine the credibility of their prosecutions. You studied this. Go ahead and explain it as you see it and understand it now, Professor.
Well, the Department of Justice really made the case for these pardons, and it was hard to do because most of us supported the people responsible for the riot being held accountable. It was a terrible day. But the Justice Department unleashed what one of its top lawyers called a shock and awe campaign, and they just scooped up hundreds of people. They often demanded really excessive sentences, in my view. Most of these people were charged with just trespass or unlawful entry. Most of them were not violent. The government tended to oppose bail. They kept a number of them for a very long time in segregation. In some cases, they demanded limitations on what people could say or read or associate after they were released. All of this tended to undermine their case. And so when the president campaigned on this issue, I think a lot of people wanted to see this chapter closed. And he certainly did that. I mean, this was broader than most people expected or even asked for.
So I'm with them so far. I think that what happened on January 6th was an embarrassment. I have always said the 2020 election was not stolen. And regardless, storming the Capitol to try to change the result or whatever was always wrong and a ridiculous endeavor. At the same time, though, prosecutors under Biden threw the book at these people and really were extremely overzealous in so many ways that I've read about and seen about. And a lot of people got caught up in serious legal trouble, even though they really didn't do much beyond being on the Capitol property when they weren't supposed to or whatever. And when you contrast that with the incredibly lax approach prosecutors took at the state and local level to the literal riots that left dozens dead during Black Lives Matter, I can understand why people are like, hey, that's kind of BS. And as far as I'm concerned, people who were prosecuted for minor crimes or coerced, frankly, into taking plea deals and are now pardoned, who didn't actually hurt anyone, I think if they've done some jail time, they've probably served more than their fair share of accountability for this. But I actually appreciated what incoming Vice President J.D. Vance had said recently, that the Trump administration was going to pardon the nonviolent participants. But the violent people, remember, dozens of police officers were injured and attacked by mobs at this Capitol riot. They weren't going to be pardoned. That's what J.D. Vance told us. Take a listen.
January 6th pardons, President Trump says there's a process. Where is the line drawn on who will and wouldn't be considered for a pardon?
I think it's very simple. Look, if you protested peacefully on January the 6th and you've had Merrick Garland's Department of Justice treat you like a gang member, you should be pardoned. If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned. And
apparently, J.D. and Trump not on the same page, because as well as the many nonviolent people that he pardoned, Trump also pardoned dozens of violent criminals who assaulted cops. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's from Jonathan Turley, that conservative law professor who's defended many of the people in terms of the overzealous prosecutions who were charged in relation to January 6th. He wrote that this action from Trump also extended to violent cases. This included Israel James Easterday, who received 30 months for pepper spraying an officer. It also included Daniel Joseph DJ Rodriguez, who was sentenced to 151 months for not only calling for violence before the riot, but then attacking an officer. It also included Thomas Andrew Castleman, who was sentenced to 40 months for pepper spraying an officer, and Curtis Davis, who was sentenced to 24 months for punching officers. It wasn't just Jonathan Turley pointing this out, but the independent publication, The Free Press, also recounted in an editorial more acts of violence that Trump has issued pardons for. They write, consider Robert Scott Palmer, who traveled to Washington, D.C. from Largo, Florida, joined the mob, and assaulted police with an empty fire extinguisher, a 4 to 5 foot wood pole, an orange traffic cone, a piece of scaffolding, and a wooden plank. He pleaded guilty in the face of overwhelming photographic and video evidence and received a 5-year sentence in December 2021. Yet now Palmer, along with dozens of others who were convicted of violent offenses against police and others that day, is being released from prison and having his criminal conviction wiped out. I'm sorry, but I think this is wrong. I think if you violently assaulted police officers at the Capitol as part of this riot and you were sentenced to several years in prison, you should serve it. You shouldn't be pardoned. That's violent crime. That's not peaceful protest. That's not even light trespassing, misdemeanors, or anything like that. That's serious shit. Dozens of police officers were seriously wounded and injured. As the Free Press continued, this gross misuse of presidential power, how they characterize Trump's pardons of the violent offenders, should offend anyone who believes in the rule of law and respects those who wear the badge. Of the aforementioned 172 offenders, 69 pleaded guilty to assaulting police with a dangerous weapon, everything from bats, knives, and tasers to improvised weapons like stolen riot shields, fire extinguishers, and pieces of broken furniture. They did this to try to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. More than 140 officers from the DC Metro Police and Capitol Police were ultimately assaulted that day. Injuries included burns, lacerations, broken ribs, and concussions. Guys, that's not okay for people to violently assault police officers who were just trying to uphold the transfer of power from one administration to the next after an election. But Trump has pardoned these people. And I'm sorry, but that's wrong. I don't support that. I think pardoning the people who had the book thrown at them, even though they were nonviolent, is one thing that I can potentially understand and get on board with. But pardoning the violent people, no. This really undermines, I think, the Republican Party's ability to credibly claim that they're the party of the rule of law, of tough on crime, except when you assault cops in a pro-Trump riot? What? A good rule of thumb for stuff like this is to try to remove the partisan framing and put it on the opposite lens and see how you would react. If Obama supporters had done this in a pro-Obama riot at the Capitol, and then Biden had pardoned them a couple of years later, how would people on the right respond to this? Would they say, oh, it's okay, you know, the prosecutors were overzealous, well, what about the other examples where people weren't prosecuted? No, they would say, yes, there are other examples where people weren't prosecuted, but two wrongs don't make a right. And just because the other side is hypocrites, we shouldn't be as well. And if you violently attack cops in a riot, that's a crime. And it should be. And you shouldn't be let off the hook just because they're on your side politically by a president. Now, I guess part of the reason that Trump won't even catch that much heat for this is that Biden literally pardoned his son and his whole family. It's like the pardon power has become very corrupt at this point, and they're not using it to correct actual injustices. They're using it to just protect themselves and their allies and their family members and reward their friends, I guess. So the whole thing, honestly, lately, I'm wondering if we need to restrict the pardon power in a constitutional amendment or something in some way. But to me, this is a big misstep from Trump. It's one we all knew he was going to do. He's been very clear about this, but I think his personal sympathy for these people that's kind of wrapped up in his own ego, where he doesn't believe he lost the election, even though he did, blinds him to the truth of this. And actually, it's just hypocritical. He's the I back the blue guy, but he just pardoned people who viciously beat cops. Like, the math is not mathing. I'm disappointed to see it, and I think it will not be remembered well. But what do you guys think? If you disagree with me, hey, I want to hear from you. I'm open-minded to hearing what you have to say. Do let me know in the comments below. Do hit that like button while you're at it, and make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. We have these honest conversations on this channel, on this show, and I hope that even if you don't agree with everything I say, you want to be a part of that. Now, guys, that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will talk again tomorrow. What a crazy time to be alive, and what a exciting time to be doing this show with you all. With that, we'll talk again soon.